Hey everybody, Sam Music Critic here, and in today's video I'm going to be reviewing the new double album from Coldplay, Everyday Life. I know I just pointed in the wrong direction, please don't bully me. Everyday Life is the 8th studio album from British pop rock band Coldplay, and I'm guessing you're definitely very familiar with them, especially in this decade. Even though they are quite popular, especially in their previous decade with their more pop rock sound, they've definitely crossed over into this decade quite well with their more pop mainstream friendly direction. You've got albums like Milo's Iloto, Ghost Stories, A Head Full of Dreams, that tackle a much more mainstream friendly sound, and it's definitely a good choice if they want to stay relevant in this decade, and it's been working out quite well for them. They've collaborated with artists like the Chainsmokers, Tove Lo, Rihanna. They did a remix with Seeb. Seriously, who chose to name themselves Seeb? And honestly, I don't actually mind their music, even their more pop friendly stuff like the Hymn for the Weekend remix with Seeb, or A Sky Full of Stars. I genuinely think those are pretty good songs, and I don't know, I just choose them over Imagine Dragons any day, that's all I'm trying to say. And looking at their brand new album, Everyday Life, it's definitely a much more ambitious and less mainstream friendly direction, with not a lot of the songs following any specific pop formula or direction or anything, and some of the songs even going outside the conventional norms of your standard radio music, which is a pretty bold move for Coldplay, and it's working out quite well from them in this album. And it's definitely a very big left turn after their previous album, A Head Full of Dreams, a very pop rock driven album. And it's also quite longer than some of their other albums. Well, I wouldn't say quite longer, as it's, I guess, just like 10 minutes longer than your standard Coldplay album at 52 minutes. And it's definitely somewhat short for a double album, but yeah, it's just somewhat longer than some of their other albums. And it's separated into two different sections with 8 tracks, Sunrise and Sunset. So with all this information in mind, how do Coldplay play it out? Well, let's see. The sound is definitely very different from anything we've ever heard from Coldplay, especially considering their previous few albums. The album itself, though, is incredibly well performed and mostly well executed. The album also includes many different musical elements from different cultures and genres. You've got stuff like bluegrass, doo-wop, blues, folk, ambient, spoken word, and jazz coming into play on the album, and most of the time, it actually works out pretty well for them. I'd even compare this to Vampire Weekend's most recent album, Father of the Bride, as they both feel like a whole bunch of different mixtures of cultural elements and genres, and most of them come out with extremely fantastic tracks. But the nitpick I do have with both albums is that they're both quite mixed bags in terms of cohesion and structure, which makes them a little bit harder to enjoy as a full album, but still, they do produce some pretty fantastic tracks, I won't lie. And I guess the more worldly sound of this album fits in with the lyricism and themes, as they deal with very important issues such as racism, police brutality, and war, mainly in the Middle East and stuff. They talk about this a lot on the track Orphans, and it advocates for the message that we're all equal, regardless of race, religion, or nation, or whatever, we're all equal. And sometimes the images they portray in the song are very vivid and clear, especially on tracks like Trouble in Town and Daddy. Sometimes, however, one main criticism I have with the lyricism here is that it is a bit surface level and it doesn't really dive too deep in the topics they're talking about, and it can even feel quite sugar-coated to what the real situation is. But I guess the good thing is it does get a good message across, and their heart's definitely in the right place, and like I said before, sometimes they do give some very detailed descriptions and images of what those situations might actually feel like. In the track Trouble in Town, they're using an actual spoken word element from a brawl between a police officer and a black man. It definitely, sets the scene for you and makes you really invested into the story of the track. So I'm gonna list some positives and highlights of the album, because there are definitely some really high points in this album. Most of the time, the really wacky and weird ideas on the album work quite well, and sonically, this album has a lot of fantastic tracks. The track Church is an incredibly beautifully produced pop track, and definitely one of my favorites on the album. It's a huge grower, like everything else on this album. The song Trouble in Town depicts a very violent and discriminatory scene, while also sounding amazing, and the build up towards the end is incredibly beautiful. I love that part. Arabesque is definitely one of the best Coldplay songs I've ever heard. The mix of jazz and this very large anthem-like sound is just straight up incredible. Don't know about that part where he starts yelling, "Same frickin' blood!" But, I just love this track, seriously. The track Guns is a short little track, which I kinda like. The lyricism is dealing with, guns and school shootings. I don't know, definitely works way better in the album like every other track. Listening to it on its own just feels kind of awkward, I guess. The track Orphans, just like every other track in this album, is a massive grower. It's definitely a really catchy pop track, which I'll probably see myself coming back to a lot. In fact, I won't be surprised if this comes on the radio. You'll have people saying, oh man, this song again? And I'll just be like, I want it all! Echo is a very sweet little folk track, a nice addition, and Cry 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 is a very sweet 50s doo-wop sounding sound. It's definitely the perfect slow dancing music, I'd say. And then the final two tracks on the album, Champion of World and Everyday Life, are really great and incredibly well produced, a nice way to end off this album. I thought Everyday Life was kind of a underwhelming closer at first, but it definitely grew on me over time, and the actual message of it definitely, you know, resonated with me in terms of the context of the album. But with those positives, there are some criticisms I have. Some of them I have mentioned before, some of them are fairly new. There are some songs in this album that feel really out of place. You've got songs like Broken and Wonder of the World, Power of the People, especially that last track I just mentioned. I'm not saying their name again. It just feels incredibly out of place, even though it does transition well into Arabesque. The song Cry Cry Cry, like I mentioned before, is kind of out of place with the context of the album, but still one of my favorite tracks on the album. And some tracks in the second half aren't really all that interesting, like Old Friends or... I will admit, it does serve its purpose, as in the middle section it's reciting this 13th century poem about empathy and giving a new meaning to it that hadn't been known at the time. I thought the opening track to this album, Sunrise, definitely could have had a lot more to it. Definitely could have done some more to really invite you into the worldly atmosphere of this album, because when I first heard this album I was like, this is gonna be just decent, you know. But I was definitely surprised with what I got after that, so... Thank you, every other track after Sunrise. Overall, I think this is a very ambitious album for Coldplay that takes quite a lot of different risks, and while the execution of the album isn't completely perfect, and yeah, this album does definitely have its flaws, majority of the time it actually succeeds at the risks it takes thematically and sonically. And despite the very all-over-the-place sound of the album and the sort of surface-level explorations to the world issues they're tackling, sonically, this album is incredibly solid and does evoke very vivid images and scenes of the issues that they're tackling on this album, and I quite like it. Overall, I enjoyed it. I guess my score for this album would have to be a 7.4 out of 10. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Goodbye. The sound instrumentation is very different. Oh wait, I literally just did this part.